Welcome. This is an interview on behalf of the ESCoE Economic Measurement Conference 22. And we're delighted to have with us Professor Sir Charlie Bean, who is Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, and who, as most of you watching will know, has held many significant roles in which he has been a user of economic statistics, including Chief Economist and Deputy Governor for Monetary Policy at the Bank of England, sitting on both the Monetary Policy and Financial Policy Committees, and more recently executive member of the Office for Budget Responsibility. He also led an independent review of UK economic statistics, the Bean Review. Published in 2016, this contained 6 strategic recommendations underpinned by 24 specific recommendations, all of which were intended to strengthen the UK's statistical framework. And this morning, Sir Charlie delivered a keynote talk at the conference, reflecting on the progress made in developing economic statistics since his review and reflecting on the issues that lie ahead. Charlie, thank you very much for your talk. You highlighted progress in addressing known shortcomings in UK economic statistics, as well as progress in capturing new developments. You stressed the need to remain agile, given future measurement challenges that will need to be addressed, and we can come to these in a minute. And you also highlighted the need to link statistics production with academia to create that two-way interest in economic measurement that will help address future challenges. How do you think we can best further develop and maintain that curiosity around measurement, both within academia and amongst statistics producers? Do you have any specific thoughts around that?
Well, as far as the producers are concerned, the key was changing the culture in the ONS to become more inquisitive about their own statistics and more challenging. And John Pullinger and his management team were instrumental, I think, in changing that culture, which the current management have continued. It's important, of course, that it doesn't regress and is maintained. But an important part of my review was to try and also strengthen the links with outside experts and academics. A part of that was bringing in expertise from outside, but it also I wanted to try and get academic economists more interested in measurement issues. I think a lot of, particularly macroeconomists, they'll start their course with half a lecture on national income accounting, and then that'll be about the end of any consideration of measurement. Whereas there are a lot of conceptually interesting challenges in measurement, and also from the point of view of being an applied economist and a policy maker, you need to understand the limitations of statistics. And ESCoE I always saw as a key component of that, as establishing something that would function as a two-way mechanism for both getting more expertise into the ONS, but also encouraging outside academic economists and people from other disciplines to think more about measurement challenges. And I should say I've been pretty pleased with how it's worked out in its first 5 years.
Do you think that maybe, there's been a lot of developments in data science, there's a lot of new techniques. I wonder, is that something that might generate interest amongst economists in getting more involved? Some of these new techniques that are available. And also COVID. I think measurement was something that was very difficult during COVID, and it probably brought to a broader group of people's attention the importance of it. Do you think that factors like that might also support a longer-term interest amongst economists?
Well, there's no doubt that data science is a hot topic. And quite a few of our PhD students, for instance, instance at LSE, are doing theses which use aspects of data science, either in how they're harvesting information, harvesting data, often from text rather than conventional statistics, coming up with clever ways of doing that. And of course, in the wider world, there is very high demand for data scientists, which in turn means students are coming along wanting to do courses in data science. So I think this is a development that is very much here to stay. I'm in favour of bringing new tools and techniques into this territory. I think the one thing we have to be careful about is assuming that it's a silver bullet, that having these techniques obviates thinking about what's going on, because sometimes they can be a little bit black boxy in the way they're used, and one has to be an intelligent user of the techniques. But I do think they're here to stay. As regards the pandemic, I think that was a very interesting example of the importance of being flexible and agile as a National Statistical Institute. The Office for National Statistics, nobody's going to be on the doorstep banging their pots and pans in the way we did for the NHS. But frankly, I think they did a pretty good job during the pandemic in terms of responding to the special challenges. First of all, actually setting up the infection survey, the random testing of the population, was actually very important in enabling us to get a clear picture relatively early on about the spread of the pandemic. But in the economic statistics area, there were, first of all, challenges in some of the standard data series. So things like collecting prices becomes rather more difficult if all the shops are shut, which they were during lockdown. So the ONS had to adjust what they were doing. Surveys that involve face-to-face elements like the labour force survey, international passenger survey, they were no longer possible, at least in the standard mode. On top of that, the pandemic was an event in which things changed very rapidly. So if you think about the lockdown in spring of 2020, we went from an economy that was open to an economy that a third of it was closed in the space of a few days. And working out the consequences of that for activity, and also as the lockdown measures were unwound, was very challenging. So in the policy making world, so this is particularly in my role at the Office of Budget Responsibility, we had to look at a range of other high frequency real-time indicators. So examples here would include the Google mobility indices, which they're based on smartphone usage and how the smartphones are moving around, but turned out to be quite a good correlate of things like economic activity, travel to work, things like that. So that was a particularly useful source. Data on digital payments, which the ONS and the Bank of England had access to, were very useful to us to see how spending was pivoting online. And then you had special surveys, particularly the ONS's business interruption due to COVID survey, and equally the bank's decision maker panel, which provided a lot of very valuable intelligence about what was going on. And finally, I think I should say that administrative data this time around was useful, so we did have access to some of the insights that you could glean from PAYE data that was telling us how the furlough scheme was being used. And I think all of this together emphasizes the value of being agile in the statistics that are used during events like this.
So the ONS did develop and keep the evidence base flowing under very difficult circumstances, and new data sources, were key to that. But also, I think that there was an increase in data sharing between government departments, and probably also between the private and the public sector, in the spirit of the emergency that the country was facing at the time. And I guess one question is then how can we cement that learning from the pandemic, and how can we make data sharing more of a norm? I mean, we've had the Digital Economy Act of 2017, but it still seems that there's improvements in sharing that could take place, and it would allow for much better measurement.
Yeah, I mean, a key thing, of course, is that this was happening before the pandemic itself. So the Digital Economy Act 2017, which is an omnibus act with lots of elements in to do with the digital economy, but did include a couple of chapters relating to the use of administrative data for research purposes and for the purposes of collecting official statistics, constructing official statistics. Prior to that act, although in principle the Office for National Statistics could access administrative data such as tax bases and so forth, in practice the protocols were very clunky. And the Digital Economy Act made the protocols easier to operate and gave the statisticians a generalized right of access for statistical purposes. So that was an important landmark in my view. And the ONS were already in train of trying to exploit VAT data and PAYE data as well, for the purposes of improving measures of GDP, and in particular bringing elements of expenditure and income into the monthly releases rather than the early releases just relying on output measures, as was the case in the past. The pandemic, I think, highlighted the value of that access to administrative data. So, for instance, at OBR, we got value out of the detail of the PAYE data in relation to understanding the furlough scheme and how it was being applied in different industries and different parts of the country. It should be said, though, that it's still work in progress, because you can change protocols, but it doesn't necessarily completely change the culture within the civil service. And there is still an instinctive reluctance in many departments to share data. Now, the Act means that ultimately the ONS may be able to get it, but it sometimes requires escalating it through from lower levels of the civil service up to higher levels to get it unlocked. And now what I hope is that in due course there'll be a change of culture in the civil service to realise that data sharing is part of providing better public services. And I do think it's essential for tackling things like the levelling up agenda that there is a joining up of data sets which have very detailed geographical information contained within them. The other area, of course, is private sector big data, which is growing like topsy. The ONS have started trying to exploit some of that, particularly scanner data, so they've talked to some of the supermarkets to get access to that information. My understanding is that that's turned out to be quite fruitful work. The issue, I think, though, going forward will always be, does the private sector entity see that it's getting anything out of this? Because no doubt it is providing some burden on them. There is an interesting parallel with Stats Canada, where Stats Canada actually has a legal right to access private information if it wants to. They told me when I was doing my review that they never actually have to use the Act, which has been enforced, I think, in something like 1947. It's been around a long time. They can usually come to an agreement with the private sector entity to do something in return for access to the data. So that may be providing some expert analysis of the data or whatever. So I would hope going forward that we see more of this taking place, certainly exploiting the information that is being gathered, often indirectly, but a lot of it by private sector entities.
Well, that'd be very nice. So you discussed in your talk also, I mean, you mentioned the leveling up agenda just now and the need for these very large data sources to be able to inform that agenda. You also talked about the changing patterns of work, which of course is very relevant now that have seen this increased tendency to work from home, and also valuing nature with the, I guess, increased recognition of environmental degradation associated with human activity and impetus behind reducing carbon emissions. These areas of measurement are really quite new. Obviously there's been activity in this space for some years, but it's as if there's quite a new challenge to be addressed, a very large challenge to be addressed. So there'll be many new standards to set and practices to set. So the issues you raised in your review and the issues you raised in your talk just now, they are basically of international interest. It's not just of interest to the UK statistics. And do you see that there is sufficient international collaboration or coordination around resolving these types of measurement issues? And if not, do you think that there are vehicles for strengthening that collaboration?
Well, I certainly think that issues like increased working from home will be important going forward. It's clear that we won't go back 100% to the world that we had before the pandemic, where there was anyway increased, unusual forms of employment with the gig economy and things like that. But the key thing with people working from home for at least part of their working week will be the issue of measuring the hours that are input, and particularly if people break their day up, getting up periodically to, as the Prime Minister put it, go and get a piece of cheese from the fridge, to do something else, maybe play with their children for a bit and then go back to work. The whole issue of how many hours are being worked will become a more salient one. And it seems to be inevitable that we have to rely more on time use surveys, although I think there are opportunities for collecting that information in a more savvy way than we have in the past using digital advances. Now, as you correctly say, this is an international challenge, but lots of other countries will be experiencing similar issues. And you would certainly hope that the statistical agencies, when they're meeting together to talk about new developments and responding to them, thinking about suitable joint pieces of work. But you know, the ONS I could see as being playing a key role here, and of course one of the things I wanted ESCoE to become was a sort of leader in thinking about these issues from a more academic perspective, and acting as a catalyst for people in other jurisdictions to also do work. I think extending it from working from home, there's going to be a set of additional challenges coming from, say, population aging. So there will be, I think, more people who've retired but choosing to do volunteering or spending their time looking after very elderly parents, unpaid carers, and measuring those sorts of activities and essentially the value from them will, I think, be important in the future too. The final layer, which I don't think people have really woken up to, is the significance of artificial intelligence and how that will change the world of work, with a whole range of what we think of as skilled activities, cerebral activities, that in the past people would have thought were completely immune from being supplanted by machine, now potentially can be supplanted by machines, and not with machines as inferior substitutes, but in some cases as much better, as being less error prone. So there is empirical evidence for this, for instance, from things like radiographers and diagnosing tumours from X-rays, where appropriately trained machines can do it much more accurately than humans. So there will be substantial changes in the structure of work and in the sort of jobs that people do, which I think there will be considerable interest in tracking and evaluating the consequences, both for productivity and things like public finances.
So lots of measurement challenges ahead. And it's lovely to hear your thoughts on all of these things.
I think we will never run out of measurement challenges. The lot of a statistician is to run just to keep still because of the continually evolving economy. And that will mean, of course, that there will be lots of things for ESCoE to keep on working on.
Thank you very much, Charlie.
You're welcome.